I don't think measurements are necessarily everything.
They're not.
But I think they are a great place to find good gear, right? I think there's going to be things that sound a little bit different. There's going to be things that behave a little bit different. But a lot of that can be seen in measurements, but I still think it's very important to go listen to things instead of just looking at a measurement, hitting buy and saying, I want that, right? Because it may measure really good and you may not like it at all.
I'll tell you what, if a manufacturer says that they don't release measurements because they don't have any, I would run. I would not. You can guarantee even the ones that don't, like Klipsch never publishes data for their speakers, right? But you know that they've got measurements, and they've probably got way more measurements than I ever have taken over a speaker, you know?
So we are talking about measurements, the importance of measurements. Of course, Aaron is all about the measurements on his channel. What's that?
I said, I am.
Yeah. He's like,
or he says he is.
He's one of the go-to guys. You are the only, you're probably the only content creator that has a Klippel, correct?
Amir does as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, does he have a YouTube channel though?
He does. He rarely posts on it, but he does.
Because most of his stuff's on the forum.
Yeah.
So we'll say you're the only active content creator with a Klippel.
I'll go with that.
There you go, man.
Yeah, I'll go with at least, until he decides he sees this video and then he gets upset at you for saying that. And then he makes a video just so he's active again. Right. Yeah.
But man, we appreciate what you do because you bring not only a subjective side, which I've seen you've been adding a lot more of that on your videos, but your primary goal is, hey, how does these things measure? Because if they measure great, then just historically, the vast majority of people will tend to lean towards that if they were to do a blind test. Is that correct?
Yeah. Generally speaking. Yeah.
So we're going to have some fun with this. So if you got questions about measurements, drop those in the chat. And with that, Ryan, I think you came up with this topic, right?
Put me on the skewer.
You're putting me on the skewer. I just thought it was important.
Well, I agree with you.
Aaron knows way more about this than I do.
Yeah. So the question that you had posed was, how do we read measurements? So is that still the question?
I think it's the thing that I want people to understand is, one, how do you read measurements? How are they applicable to your room? Like, why are certain measurements important? What is good? What is bad when you're looking at said measurement? And then at what point because, and Aaron, you can argue with me if you want. I don't think measurements are necessarily everything.
They're not.
But I think they are a great place to find good gear, right? I think there's going to be things that sound a little bit different. There's going to be things that behave a little bit different. But a lot of that can be seen in measurements, but I still think it's very important to go listen to things instead of just looking at a measurement, hitting buy and saying, I want that, right? Because it may measure really good and you may not like it at all.
Yeah, I think, man, there's so many little intricacies and so many rabbit holes that you can go down when you talk about measurements. And for every argument, there can be a counter argument made, right? I mean, within reason. The thing that I tend to tell people to do is look at the measurements, use that to help you boil down to some that are reasonably linear. Or if you know, for example, that you like a particular sound, which I think most people think that they might like something, but then ultimately find out maybe they don't. But let's pretend for a minute that you know that you like a boosted top end by 3 decibels. Okay, now go find speakers that do that, right? Or you know that you like a very wide radiating speaker and you don't want one that's narrow. Okay, now go find speakers that radiate horizontally more than 50 degrees. A narrow one might be 30 degrees.
But on that topic, how do you read that? Like, what are you looking at in a measurement to figure that out?
Okay, so that would, I'm happy to do that. We can get into that. I'll have to bring up charts though, and then your audience may just be like, you know what? We don't really care.
That's what we're here for. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Or maybe they won't. I don't know.
I care. So
yeah. Okay. I can do that. Let's do that. All right. Let me do a present mode. Share screen. Do I do entire screen? Nope. I'll do that one. That one. Okie dokie. All right. So this is Wharfdale Aura 2. It's a bookshelf speaker. It's a 3-way speaker. It's got a, 6.5 inch, maybe 3 or so inch or 4 inch mid range, and then an AMT tweeter.
You just measured this recently, didn't
I
you?
did. I just measured. That's why it was one of the first ones I picked because it was the closest one on my site without me having to go through a lot of trouble. But what this has is information regarding the horizontal dispersion. And what you're looking for is it basically goes negative 180 degrees to positive 180 degrees. So this makes a circle around the speaker, and you're basically collapsing all the sound radiation into a rectangular graphic. Frequency down here, and then SPL is right here. So this value on the right, I'm pointing it like I'm actually teaching the class now, is normalized. So normally you start off with your SPL. So let's say you have a speaker that's flat from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Okay. And then as you go further around the speaker, all the way to the side and then to the back, that SPL is going to drop off. And as it's dropping off, you have less output. So this way is a nice kind of formal way of presenting that information. And it's saying, as you go from the front of the speaker at 0 degrees to the back of the speaker at 180 degrees at the tips, there is less SPL behind the speaker. Mm-hmm. And so the best way to read directivity is to look at this -6. So it's this lighter shade of red, and that lighter shade of red would be right through here. And then on the other angle would be right through here. So it's basically saying that about plus or minus 60 degrees. So plus 60 degrees, minus 60 degrees down here is roughly the sound radiation of the speaker. Now, one could say, well, what about negative 12 dBs and all that stuff? But typically in the industry, we just say negative 6 dB for the service of conversation. Okay. So this speaker, I would look at this graphic and I would say, okay, well, this one radiates at about plus or minus 60 degrees. Give you another example. Let me get rid of that. And I'll find something that's maybe a little bit more the opposite of that.
See, I'm tracking with you, and I don't, there's a lot I don't know about measurements. And so I'm understanding that. So hopefully you guys in the chat.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is this stuff is, I mean, it can be easy to explain if you happen to say the right words, but if I happen to say the wrong words, and it's super confusing. And I don't I'm dead serious, man. I could explain it 15 different ways, and one way might catch. And how am I going to know which way that is? So I basically beat my data to death when I explain things over and over and over. Right. But I feel like that's important because some people, like I say, they don't catch it one way, but another way they'll say, oh, I get it now. So I'll do this.
So I have a question.
And I appreciate you guys bearing with me here while I do
you're
this.
Good, man. So once you show the two graphs, then I got a question for you.
Okay. All right.
Folks maybe wanting to know.
Can you give me the screen? Should be shared. Okay. So again, this is the Wharfdale. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is switch over to Klipsch the Nines. And that one has a more narrow radiation pattern. Okay. So you can see that it's closer to about plus or minus 50 degrees up through the upper mid range. Right. And then at around 2 to 3 kilohertz, it starts to narrow up a little bit more and more. Eventually around 10 kilohertz, it's around plus or minus maybe 35 or so degrees. So and that just basically means that the radiation pattern, more of it is focused toward the front. There's less energy going off the side. It's about plus or minus, I would say, 40 degrees on average. Whereas this Wharfdale through the mid-range, so this is another caveat, through the mid-range is about plus or minus 60. But the Wharfdale, when you get to the 7 kilohertz area, so the upper treble, it starts to narrow up. And that creates some other potential issues depending on your likes, the frequency response of the speaker, and those things. But yeah, normally when you're trying to figure out how wide the radiation of a speaker is, you would look at this lighter red color right here, this -6 dB, and you would say, all right, well, it's roughly between plus or minus 50 degrees or something like that.
Yeah. So what is ideal? Like what would a great speaker?
Yeah. So that could be an hour-long conversation, and I'm not kidding.
I mean, generally, is there a certain kind of pattern that you're wanting to look for?
Yeah. So normally what you want is a pattern that is pretty even throughout all frequencies. And if you go and take, maybe I'll find another example here. I think I did one somewhat recently that wasn't quite that good.
And so all this can be found on Aaron's website, aaronsaudiocorner.com. So definitely show him some love. All of these are free, but he's got a great Patreon and he gives extra access. So
I do. Thank you for mentioning my Patreon.
I'm gonna hook you up, man. We're grateful you're here.
Here's an example. This is the Acoustic Energy AE100 MK2. So it's a bookshelf speaker, like a 6-inch or so mid-woofer, maybe a 1-inch dome tweeter, give or take. And we can see that this one, see how this one's kind of bouncing around and doing some odd stuff.
Sure.
So what this is saying is that the sound that's radiated out into the room isn't uniform. It's depending on what frequency, it might be 50 degrees wide, and then at another frequency, it might be 30 degrees wide. And we can take an example. Literally, we can say at 1 kilohertz for this speaker, you're at about plus or minus 80 degrees. So this region right here, this region right here. And then at, what is this?
So we don't see your mouse moving now for some.
Oh, you don't? Okay. I'm
We-
sorry.
It's on and off. Now it's moving.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. And then at 1 kilohertz, about plus or minus 80 degrees. Do you see the mouse?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And then at around, I think this is like 4 kilohertz, maybe. It's at about plus or minus 50 degrees. Okay. So what that means is that if you have a sound, and I use this example a lot. So if people here have seen my channel, they're probably like, oh my God, here we go again. But this is a good example. If you have a particular sound that is at 1 kilohertz, and it's supposed to be at the same point as maybe let's say the cymbals at 10 kilohertz in the sound stage. Well, the problem with a speaker that doesn't have uniform directivity is that the 1 kilohertz sound may be at one place, but the 10 kilohertz sound is going to be more narrow. So it's going to sound like it's in a different place. So that's one way to kind of look at how this information can be used. Okay. So ideally, you're going to have a speaker that has more uniform dispersion. This Klipsch is narrowing throughout, but I would say that the dispersion pattern of this, as far as directivity goes, is better than this speaker because this speaker is bouncing all around.
It's more linear.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The Wharfedale Aura, however, I like the sound of this speaker more because it generally has a wider dispersion than this Klipsch by about 20 degrees or so. But the problem with this one is that it does narrow in the higher frequency. So the highest frequency sounds aren't going to quite track the same way that the mid-range frequencies do, as far as like stage and location and things like that. So there's always a trade-off. And the thing about this Wharfedale is that there's a resonance around 13K or so, which kind of lifts the top end up. They left that in there because it gives it a more flat on-axis response. Because if they had taken that resonance out, and I'll just show you, be a little bit easier if I show you exactly what I mean here.
I remember you talking about this in your video.
Yeah. A lot of this is just me saying the same stuff over and over, and hopefully it helps.
Yeah.
So this is the Wharfedale. This is the black is the on-axis response, and you can see it's pretty linear. Like this is really good. But up here around 13 or 14, whatever frequency this is, there's a breakup mode. My guess, and I've learned that I was right by the designer verifying it, was that they left this breakup mode in order to give it a more neutral, let's go find it, in-room response. So this is the estimated in-room response. This is what this does is it takes all the data from the speaker all around it, vertically and horizontally, and it predicts what the speaker is going to sound like in your room in a typical room. If they had gotten rid of this right here, then this right here would have just dropped off. So you would have had a loss in the high frequency region. Okay. And that is because it narrows so drastically above 7K. I don't know how much sense that made, but basically what I'm saying is it took me 3 graphics to explain why you're going to hear what you're going to hear in a room. And that's the part where I think people lose maybe confidence in the data or just lose interest because it's not always a straightforward. I know that the go-to is to show the CEA 2034, and it's great. It's really good to have that, but you need other things. You know, I want to know what it's doing on axis. I want to know what the estimated in-room is, and I want to know what the radiation is because all of those things have factors that kind of align with what I'm looking for when I look at data.
So you're looking holistically. You're not looking.
I'm looking at everything, dude. Yeah, everything. And then it's SPL, and then it's also vertical. You know, do I have to sit in this very tight sweet spot, or do I have freedom to move up and down? You know,
like reclining in a chair, or
yeah, exactly. Or I often will say, if you have a home theater and you have multiple rows, this speaker would be a good one to show you. This is the vertical radiation, and this 0 degrees right here, that's the tweeter line. And as you go above 10 degrees, which is this little dude right here. So this window right here, very small little window. If you go above about 10 or 15 degrees, you start running into a lobing area where the sound above that tweeter line above or below is not going to sound similar to the sound directly at the tweeter line. So if you use these in a home theater, you better make sure that you compromise the main listening position, because the people sitting behind you are probably not going to hear anything similar to what you hear if you're sitting on axis with that tweeter line.
Is this the
So-
Wharfdale?
Sorry?
Is this the Wharfdale?
It is. It's still the same Wharfdale, yeah.
Yeah. So, and this is a characteristic, I think, of that uses an AMT, doesn't it?
It does. So the vertical radiation of an AMT is going to be more narrow than a typical dome tweeter.
And that's just a characteristic of that particular type of driver.
It is, yeah. And so you might still see something similar with a dome tweeter design that's a three-way. So we could look at like the KEF. This is a coaxial. And if I go and look at this guy's, first of all, we'll look at its horizontal. So its horizontal is about plus or minus 50 degrees, because this lighter shade of red is just riding right through there. So it's pretty linear, as Ryan said. The directivity is very smooth. But if I look at its vertical, it's going to be a little bit different, because it's an MTM design. Even though it's a coaxial design, it is still an MTM. So there is a little bit of an effect going on around 2 kilohertz or so. But it's still about plus or minus 40 degrees, maybe 30 degrees in the upper frequencies, for having a dome tweeter, and it's a coaxial. So there's always trade-offs. Yeah, always trade-offs.
And these are things that I think people really need to consider when they're thinking about what type of speaker they want to put in their theater, because based on how you want your seating and speaker locations, it's going to dictate what type of speaker is going to work in that particular environment. Like, as an example, when we were still talking about moving and I was going to do this big theater, I was thinking about momentarily to do Wisdom. But the problem with Wisdom is if I did a multiple row theater, if you are above or below those panels, it's like 0 degrees off axis.
Yeah.
So if you're above or below it, it's not good. So what
Yeah.
you end up having to do is make the
They
panel
stack 'em, yep.
extraordinarily tall.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
just gets out of control expensive.
Yeah.
So that was one reason why I decided, hey, I'm not going to go that way. I mean, it was one of many reasons, but that just goes on the point of when you guys are designing a room, it is very important, if you're going to do multiple rows, single row, where your speakers are going to be, how high, how low, for you to choose and look a speaker by looking at what those directivity plots are going to be like. Because if you don't, you could get yourself into a world of trouble.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, vertically is definitely a challenge. I mean, I would say that generally, if it's a three-way design and doesn't use an AMT, then you're probably okay. But you can't even guarantee that in some cases. You really still need the data to understand how much variation can I tolerate for multiple row seating.
Well, and I think that a lot of people don't even think about the vertical dispersion.
No, yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
horizontal.
Yeah.
And you never really hear people talk about vertical, but I think
Right.
it's pretty important, especially when you're starting to talk about multiple rows, because if you don't, guy behind you is going to be having a totally different experience.
Sure.
Yeah. for
Now,
sure.
some guys are asking questions about what we're talking about.
Okay.
So on those dispersion plots, Paige
Mhm.
Troop asks, so would you have to actually sit closer to a speaker for a more consistent sound field?
Well, so yes and no, right? Because there are some, it depends on how close you sit. You can technically sit too close to a speaker. Let's say you've like the Arendal speakers with their big wave guides. If you sit really, really close to that speaker, then you can actually be in the null where the speakers haven't basically converged together. I mean, that would be a pretty rare thing that you would ever be sitting that close, but I'm just giving you the extreme end of things.
I mean, how close are you talking?
Oh, honestly, man, I would probably say like half a meter or something, you know?
So
mean,
would that be maybe considered like a near field setup?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, that would be like a
That's-
near field issue.
That's
you know?
not out of the question for some people doing rear surrounds sometimes.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, you think about like people with
No,
couches
yeah,
right up against walls.
that's
and
true,
stuff. I mean,
yeah.
if the speakers are right on top of them,
Yeah.
Right.
could be causing more problems than you actually may be solving.
Yeah. No, that's true. You can actually be sitting physically in the null. You
Now,
know,
is there a chart that'll show you that?
I don't have one. I had the means of making it, but
Okay.
the effort to me probably just isn't quite worth it, to be honest
Yeah,
with you.
sure.
Yeah. But that's actually a good topic that maybe I should maybe
can mention
pursue
that.
sometime. Yeah. I'll write that down. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sticky notes.
Yeah.
So when I have conversations like these, I just jot crap down.
Yeah.
And usually about 3 years later, I'll get around to it.
Mm-hmm.
So another question about it, those plots is wider better?
Yeah, so I apologize because if anybody knows me, they know I've got ADHD. And when I answer one question, I'm answering like 15 other questions before I get back around to
I
it.
think that's important.
Yeah. So what was the question?
Is wider better?
Yeah, see, exactly.
Girl.
Personally, now I didn't know this until I started looking at data, but personally, I found that about plus or minus 60 degrees wide is what I prefer. And I really emphasize the word prefer. In a room, gosh, there's so many caveats to this. In a lively room or a small room, maybe where you're going to have the speakers right up next to the wall, a more narrow dispersion pattern might be preferred because then it's not so reflective. It's not maybe so, I don't want to use the word echoey because it's not really the word I'm trying to use here, but it's just
more maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's just almost too diffuse, I guess maybe would be the word I'm looking for there. If it's a wide radiation, in a larger room, a narrower radiation, this is my experience, tends to just have too small of a soundstage. It just kind of collapses in front of you, and it doesn't really seem to go out beyond the speakers themselves. And for reference, when I say wide versus narrow, I would say wide probably begins around 50 degrees and up, and then narrow would be like 50 degrees and lower. So the KEF coaxial designs, most of the time, I would consider those probably right on the bleeding edge of wide and narrow. Klipsch Horns designs, usually I would consider them more narrow because they're closer to like 30 or 40. Most speakers that have a standard dome tweeter on a flat baffle are going to be probably wide. Most horn-loaded waveguided speakers are probably going to be right in between like 40 to 60. And that's general take on what I've seen over the years.
Now, when you're talking about dispersion, you're talking about 40 and 30 degrees and so on. How is that represented in a speaker spec chart? Like typically, are they combining them or are they listing just one side of the axis?
So it would depend. When I say 30, 40, I'm talking plus minus. And if we go back to what I was showing a minute ago, this KEF R5 right here. Yeah. So this being the vertical, it doesn't matter. I would say that this one's about plus or minus 40 to 50 degrees, just judging on this, where this red line is. That Klipsch that I showed earlier, I would say this one's about plus or minus 50 to 40 degrees because it's 50 right through here and then narrows up, maybe even down as much as about 35 degrees. So it's plus minus. It's reference to the zero. Manufacturers may say, they may take that 30 degrees plus 30 degrees and say 60 degrees wide. I think typically in the pro audio world, that's what they do. They say a 60 by 90 waveguide or something like that. So it's really plus or minus 30 and plus or minus 45.
Okay. Yeah, because Klipsch sometimes they'll do a 60 by 90 or even a 90 by 90 or 60 by 60, just depending on, the size and the shape of that.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of what I'd normally see when a manufacturer will spec it. But that's why I like having the data, because I can just go and say, oh, well, here it's here and here it's here. And the other thing too is that, if we use this Wharfedale as an example again, that horizontal, wherever it was, somebody could say, well, it's plus or minus 60 degrees or 70 degrees. And then it's like, well, it is until the high frequency. And then it's plus or minus 30 degrees or 40 degrees, and it just depends on what frequency you're talking about. But yeah, to answer the question of which one is better, I think you need to understand what you like. And the only way to do that, unfortunately, is to have some experience and have a way to relate that back to data. Hopefully at this point, I'm almost 200 speakers in, I think. Hopefully at this point, I've tested something that you have listened to in your room, and then you can go back and use my data and say, well, I kind of liked how wide it was. The thing about wide versus narrow is there is a point where you can actually be too wide. So the widest you could possibly be would be omnidirectional 360 degrees, like those Apple smart, little smart speakers and things like that. If you listen to those, if you've listened to an omnidirectional speaker, you probably got the sense of maybe the imaging wasn't quite as precise as other speakers. Maybe a horn speaker is more precise, and that has a lot to do with the reflection. If there's a lot of reflections going on in the room, you can kind of picture it as like a signal noise. There's a whole lot of noise and there's some signal coming through, and I've got to figure out where that saxophonist or that piano is, or that cymbal is, or that vocalist is in the soundstage. And with a wider radiating speaker, especially as you go smaller and smaller in room, it's going to be harder to tell how precise that imaging is. It's going to start to smear out a little bit in size. So there's always trade-offs, man, and it's just hard to say. Ryan, in y'all's test, I was thinking about this when y'all did that blind testing, and I actually been meaning to talk to you about it, and I just now thought about this, but y'all tested it in a rather large room, and I was thinking probably what they're hearing is more of the on-axis sound in those speakers. So when I was looking at the results, I shouldn't have been looking at the estimated in-room response. I should have been looking at the on-axis and maybe that listening window response, but the estimated in-room response adds in all these reflections that probably weren't really occurring in that room because it was so large.
It was actually shown when the on-axis, because people, when they saw off-axis to the Martin Logan, stopped liking it. So that was really shown. The exact thing that what you're describing is people, as long as they were on axis, they liked it, and they realized that as they moved off axis through a speaker, the Martin Logan being the narrowest in this test, it became more undesirable. Right?
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Stuff like that's cool, man. I eat that stuff up.
Yeah. That was a cool observation.
Yeah, that's cool. And it's cool you got the data for it and you can make those relationships. So.
Yeah.
Can I rewind the conversation a couple minutes when Aaron, you mentioned the convergence has to be a certain distance before the speakers will play together nicely, and we were talking about the Arundel specifically. I think I can illustrate that because I did a near field video of the Arundel walking back with the mic, and you can kind of show that to the audience. So let me present.
What are the odds that I would pick Arundel, like, and you happen to have a video? That's cool.
Share screen, this one, share. All right, tell me if you can see it.
Yep, you're good to go.
Yeah. So I don't know if this will come across clearly, but as I move the mic closer to the speaker, you're going to see a dip start to form in about 1500 hertz with a crossover between, see, I'm like inches away and I got that big dip.
Yeah.
So even with the near field though, as I start walking back to the seats, you'll see that flattens out. Yeah. It might be a meter, half a meter, like you said, Aaron, somewhere in that range, but you'd have to be almost on top of it for that to be a problem. In regards to the convergence part. Right. The other thing I'd like to kind of get your opinion on, as you watch this thing, as I go back towards the seats, the room just dominates the response that you're getting on a speaker so much that I don't know that people generally realize that because they're not doing real-time measurements, how much it changes based on just moving the mic around. I mean, I'm not in frame here, but I'm moving that mic back to the main listening position through this course, and you're watching how much that frequency response is bouncing around.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's nice and flat when you're up close. Now look at the, well, here, coming back up to it. So I don't think you can like lose your cookies on making sure that it's absolutely flat because it won't be in your room. That's the challenge that I always have with some of this stuff. So what's your take on that? I mean, as far as.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would say you don't want flat in the room anyway. Because typically, I mean, most rooms, if you have a flat response in the room, it's just going to wind up sounding bright and certainly bass. There's going to be no bass if it's truly flat. So I think that people who don't understand that really need to get their heads wrapped around that first, because there's a lot of, I don't know the word for this, but I see a lot of people like on AVS forum and things like that will say that, well, measurements don't matter because I measured the speaker flat in my room and it still sounded like junk. Yeah, because you measured in a room. But there's a difference between anechoic measurements and in-room measurements. And in-room, typically what you want is like a slowly decreasing. I think it's like 0.7 dB per octave. So it winds up being in between 5 to 7 dB between, what is it, like 200 hertz to 20 kilohertz, and just kind of like a tapered down response. Of course, if you're going for a room correction and things like that, and you're trying to hit a target curve, I'm of the mindset that your target curve should be kind of whatever the speakers are doing natively. So if your speakers are falling off pretty quickly, I don't think that you should boost them. I think you should probably reorient your speakers or buy different speakers that have maybe a wider radiation pattern to pick that top end up natively. Otherwise, you're just going to be introducing a lot of extra power. But that's
you may kind of for your main listening position, but anything off axis could potentially be a disaster.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for sure. So to answer your question more specifically, yeah, at some point you start getting where the room dominates, and I'm sure you probably know the term by now, Schroeder frequency.
Oh yeah.
And the easiest way to measure that for those who don't know, at least for the 1 seat position, is just to do a whole bunch of microphone measurements, like in a 1 foot by 1 foot cubic window. And what you'll look for is where the response is kind of the same, and then look for where it starts diverging pretty wildly. Most rooms for seat to seat variation is going to be like what, 400, 500, 600 hertz, somewhere around there, right? And again, it depends on the size of the room. But below that frequency, you can expect that that's where you're going to have to apply equalization, because the room is so dominant. You know, the size of the room, the length of the room, the width, the height, all those things play into that. So yeah, you're going to have to use equalization, but above that, you can actually use the data. And I've found, doing this many times, that the estimated in-room response, like I showed a minute ago, is pretty dang accurate to what I measure in room using a moving microphone method, within like 1 to 2 decibels, from about 600 hertz all the way up to about 10 kilohertz, where 10 kilohertz, usually there's more room attenuation and things like that. So it's not quite as reliable, but it's enough to give me a good idea. And I would even suggest, if you have the means, to take my estimated in-room response and copy it into REW, overlay it over the measured in-room response, see what you get. And then if you're trying to hit a target curve, just try to tweak the little peaks, you know, that are boosted up a little bit here or there, but try to make that target curve more along the lines of what that speaker is naturally doing. So I don't even know if that answered your question, but that's a lot of word salad I use.
I think there's some interesting things too that, and I'm not trying to throw sand in the air by any means. This is me thinking through this.
Yeah.
It showed on the on-axis response to that Wharfdale how it had that little peak at, what was it, 15, 16,000 hertz or whatever.
Yeah,
it was at the higher end.
Yeah.
And that was to combat off-axis being too
super
low.
narrow.
Yeah, exactly. So first things first, I want to remind the audience, because some of the audience isn't as advanced as you are by any means, right? That when you're talking about the charts that you're showing, it's, if you're on axis, it doesn't apply as much as if you're sitting in the left or the right seat, as we're talking about these, or the second row that's elevated above the thing, because the on axis is 0 tempo. That's in the middle, like that 0 bar. If you're 30 degrees, 50 degrees, 60 degrees off axis, that's what we're talking about. So if you're in the left seat or the right seat, that type of thing.
Yeah.
The second thing is, you get a little bit of some mystery, and you might not be mystery to you, but it's mystery to me, in the sense that you elevated that tweeter at 16,000 hertz or whatever the designer did. At some distance, that starts to dissipate quicker than other frequencies, because the high frequency rolls off at distance faster than low frequency. I don't know at what distance that is. That's another little part of the equation that gets a little fuzzy to me. So like, is it at 12-foot distance? Does that matter? In a typical room, is it a 6-foot distance that matters? Is it a 30-foot distance? I don't know. So at what point, like, yeah, that doesn't probably look great to have that 16 hertz bump, but if you're at 12 foot, is it still there? And that's your in-room response that you're saying they calculate. Is there a standardized distance that's that in-room response is calculating too? Kind of?
Yeah. So for that estimated in-room response, per the CTA 2034 spec, it's 2 meters.
Okay.
So, and I could actually calculate that out as far as I wanted with the Clipple software, because the Clipple measures it, and then you basically say, all right, I want you to tell me what's going on at 2 meters, or I can say, I want you to tell me what's going on at 30 meters, because that's what some of the pro sound guys are using these for.
What do you think the average seating distance is for people in home theater?
I've done enough polls on this. I did one on AVS and I did one on my own YouTube page, and I want to say that if I had 9 feet would probably be a pretty reasonable average. Yeah, it was actually surprising. I thought that if you really
thought it'd be further away.
I thought it'd be like 10 or 12.
Yes. I want to think. I think I put in maybe it was 1 to 3 and 3 to 6 and 6 to 9, and then something like I kind of did them in steps, and I just had people vote. And if I recall correctly, I think like the 9-foot area was probably the most common. It was kind of surprising. But yeah, so the air attenuation, I'll be honest with you, I'm aware of that being a factor. I've only ever considered that a thing for, pro audio, where you're really, really far away. In my experience in a home, it's not an issue. I think the bigger thing is going to be just your standard room furnishings are going to capture some of that higher frequency energy. Even drywall, can capture some of the higher frequency energy too, at least to some degree, no pun intended. But then also I'll throw this in there since you mentioned it about the estimated interim response, kind of being dictated on or predicated on the 0 degrees. So I'll, if you don't mind throwing this back up. So what I do, and I've been doing it maybe for like a year and a half now, is I do estimated interim response in black, and that's 0 degrees. So that's if the speaker's pointed directly at you. But then I also do it 30 degrees if the speaker's pointed 30 degrees off axis from you. So good speakers, what it'll do is they'll track pretty well. A poorer speaker, generally what'll happen is you'll see a difference in the crossover region, and then you'll see it kind of combine in the lower upper frequency, let's just say like 4 to 6 kilohertz. And then the top end will start to fall off again. And usually that's going to be because the crossover just isn't really that well built. So there's a directivity mismatch at the crossover. And with a speaker like that, typically it's going to sound kind of bright in room.
Is that what we're seeing in about 2000 hertz on that graph? That little bump there?
This right here?
Yes.
So that's probably already a resonance in the driver itself, and not so much and that's not an issue between the on axis versus the off axis, because the black and the red both track that. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's not really a crossover issue. I can find you an example. Let me see here. Something maybe that's not too good in that regard. I hate to pick on it, but it's the Sonus Faber dude right here. Whee! Look at that on axis. Oh, that one's wrong. I had to update that. I forgot about that. Okay. Aperion Audio. Let's see if I can use this one. Oh, that one actually looks pretty good too. Okay, I'm having trouble finding you a bad one, which is a good thing, right? Man, actually, all of these are tracking pretty well. Well,
read between the lines. We're looking at Aaron's least favorite speakers here as he's cooking
right,
more.
right.
Well, maybe they're not my least favorite. They're just ones that don't have as good off-axis performance as
Aaron's
maybe
thinking
one
is,
would
I
hope.
thought this speaker sucked more than it actually did.
Here you go. Here you go. Yeah, right. That's what I was
the
thinking.
review on that one.
The Don Audio Emit 20. So the 0 degrees is black, 30 degrees is in red. And you can see that at some point, what you expect is the red is going to start to taper off, right? Just because it's turned away from you. But what happens is it tapers off between about maybe 1 kilohertz to 2 or 3 kilohertz, but then it comes back.
Right.
And then it tracks again, but then it falls back off. So this speaker right here, I can tell you based on experience and in-room measurements, that it does indeed sound a bit harsh in this like 4K area. And then the top end is, to me, is overly boosted. It sounds a bit unnatural. So that's where data can help you. And you can kind of get an idea of, what makes sense for me to aim the speaker one way versus another.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot, guys. I'm serious. Like, I mean, I've been doing this, and I will tell you honestly, the more that I do this, the more I realize how little I know, but how exciting it is to be able to continue to learn these things.
It's a good place to be.
Yeah, it's cool, man. I enjoy it.
So when somebody is picking a speaker, right? We've been talking a lot about dispersion and things like that. What are the measurements they should be looking at?
The measurements that I look at are the CEA 2034, because I want to know what the on-axis response was, and I want to know what the directivity is. I want to know how well the off-axis tracks the on-axis. I want to look at, I'll just show you guys once I can pull an example up. I'm going to close out all this stuff because it's very boring to me at this point. I want to find a good speaker. Let me see here. Let's look at the JBL 698 Tower. We'll do that one because that one will probably be pretty popular with some folks around here. Okay, JBL 698 Tower. So if I'm looking for a good speaker, the first thing I'm going to go to is...
Hang on a second. There you go.
Okay, sorry about that. I got ahead of myself. I'm going to scroll back up. 698 Tower. This is what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go to the CEA 2034 data, and I'm going to say, what's this black line look like? What's the on-axis response look like? This speaker, it's not great, kind of bounces around a bit, but within reason, I'd say it's about plus or minus 2 decibels for the most part. Then I'm going to come down here. I'm going to look at this dash blue line. Now, ideally, you want this to be a line of some sort. It can either be increasing, which means that as with frequency goes higher, it just gets more and more narrow, or it can be flat, which means it's an omnidirectional speaker. This particular speaker, it's kind of flat-ish, but it has a kind of a dip through this 1 kilohertz area. but that's just due to the vertical offset from the mid-range to the tweeter. And I'm willing to ignore that because I know what that is. Then higher up here, it's flat. So the more linear this dash blue line is, the more equalizable it is. So say, for example, you're looking at this and you're thinking, oh, that peak is going to jump out at me. I'm not going to like this at 1.5 kilohertz. Well, according to this, it's reasonably flat in the directivity, which means the off axis follows the on axis response. So that means you could equalize this down some and make it sound better to your own ears. And then overall, just the speaker would take well to equalization. So I would say, all right, well, this is a reasonable one to start with because they're $800 a pop. It's got a good bit of output. So let's see what else is going on with the speaker. I'd go to the horizontal contour. Knowing what I know, I want about plus or minus 50, 60, 70, somewhere around that ballpark. This speaker is about plus or minus 50 to 60 degrees, depending on where I'm looking. Okay, passes that test. Now I want to know, what about vertically? Am I going to be having anybody sit behind me? If they're sitting behind me, then it might be a problem because at about 15 degrees above and 15 degrees below the tweeter, with the tweeter being this 0 degree line right here, there's a suck out in this mid-range area in the crossover region. So that's going to be problematic for second row seating. If it's just me and I'm on the prime row and I can put my ear at that horn, I'm good to go. No problems there. And the next thing would be impedance. I don't really pay attention to impedance. I mean, I'm going to buy something that can power it, so I don't really care. If I want to know sensitivity, I can get it from this graph. I can also get it from the CEA that we just looked at, but sensitivity average is 90 decibels. That's pretty good. And then we can see, like I said before, the response is mostly within plus or minus 2 decibels. There's this fall off and breakup issue. What is that, like 16 kilohertz? I'm probably not too concerned about that personally. If I'm shopping for a home theater speaker on a reasonable budget, I'm going to let that slide. And then, let's see, do I have anything else? Oh, I want to look at distortion. Multi-tone distortion, full range. If it's below negative 30 dB, this line right through here, then it's got plenty of output capability with low distortion. If it's above this, then it might be a problem.
Okay.
And then the other one I'm going to look at is compression to see how much dynamic range this speaker has. And what this is, just a quick kind of coverall, 0 dB would be the reference point at 76 decibels. And then what I do is I ramp up the output to 86 decibels, 96 decibels, and then 102 decibels. And I want this speaker to have a red, blue, and purple line to be completely flat because that means no matter the volume, the frequency response is still the exact same. So there is no loss in bass as I turn the volume up. There's no compression. We can say 86 and 96 decibels. You're pretty close. I mean, you're within a half a decibel. That's adequate. I'm fine with that. At 102 decibels for this one speaker anechoic at 1 meter, we lose some output capability below about maybe 60 hertz. And then even you can look at this and say, well, you're almost down at 1.5 decibels at 80 hertz. So I could say, well, I'm probably going to need a crossover to a subwoofer. Maybe 100 hertz would suffice, but certainly below 60 hertz or below 60 hertz, I need to cross over to the subwoofer. This stuff right here is going to have some dynamic range impact as well. This is probably due to the crossover region, but I don't know without being able to dive deeper into the speaker. But those are the main things that I'm looking for when I'm shopping for a speaker. You know, if I order one of these speakers and test it out, I want to know how linear it is. Can I equalize it? If it's not perfectly linear, that's okay. I can still equalize it. What's the radiation look like? And does it take the output that I'm going to need? And that's it. I mean, that's it. That's a lot, but that's it.
No speaker is going to be great in every one of those things that you looked at. So when somebody's buying a speaker, and if they're looking at your measurements or somebody else's measurements, do they have to kind of determine what's the most important to them? Like what's the most important aspect, whether it's linearity or whether it's on or off axis response or whether it's, you know, the directivity. There's a lot to take in on that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's not easy, and I understand why people get discouraged, and that's why I try to walk through some of this stuff in my reviews and say, like, you know, these are the highlights, these are the things that I would consider more important, and when you're shopping, these are the things that you probably want to pay attention to. So I pulled up this JBL 4367 because to me, it's kind of a benchmark for a dynamic speaker that has really good linearity, and so I'll just walk through some of this. This really is one of my favorite speakers of all time, but it's like 16,000 MSRP a pair.
Oh,
Yeah, it's not cheap. The on-axis response, look at that. I mean, it's within plus or minus 1 decibel. You do have a peak up here, but I'm okay with that. It's super narrow. I'm not going to worry too much about that. The ERDI, good EQ ability. These dips and peaks right through here are namely the crossover, and then there is a little bit of this guy right here, this lip on this cabinet kind of sticks out, and it really causes an issue right around this region. So overall, I'm okay with the directivity of the speaker. It's pretty equalizable. And then let's just skip to the dynamic range real fast, because that's the one that's like, what? This one to me is textbook. Like, if you're trying to compare and figure out what dynamic range should look like, this is it, because you can see as I go from 76 to 86 to 96 to 102 decibels, this speaker has 76 to 102 is 26 dB. It has at least 26 decibels of dynamic range. I mean, there's hardly any change in the response as you increase the volume. That's phenomenal, right? So this is like a perfect home theater speaker. However, the drawback that this speaker does have, at least personally speaking, is the radiation is somewhat narrow. It's about plus or minus 50 through the mid range, and then it kind of gets up to plus or minus 60 in the upper area. Personally, I would prefer it to be plus or minus 60 throughout, but there's always going to be trade-offs. So that's kind of another example to look at. I could pick a bad one, but I don't think we want to do that. Oh, yeah. Oh, and this 4367, if you want to look at the vertical, if you're thinking multi-row seating, you might be all right. You know, plus or minus 20 degrees, I think, is probably reasonable with this speaker. But if the person sitting behind you is more than 20 degrees above that tweeter level, that might be a problem for them.
Now, on your compression testing,
yeah,
you'd recommend doing that at a level and making sure that the speaker is capable of doing that at the listening level that you're going to be utilizing. Like if you're listening at above 102, say you're doing reference with EQ, you still want to make sure that it's getting the same response as what you see here.
Yeah, that would be ideal. And it's worth pointing out that this was referenced at 1 meter anechoic. So typically what happens when you put a speaker into a room, you're going to get some boundary reinforcement, at least on the lower end for sure. The higher end going to depend on how narrow the directivity is. But you're also using 2 speakers. So you automatically gain 6 decibels because you double your power and you double your speaker, right? So you automatically gain 6 decibels. So this 102 at 1 meter becomes 108 at 1 meter in a room, plus some boundary reinforcement, which can be another 6 decibels or so, give or take. So, I mean, it's even higher, but that's why I just try to make everything reference the same thing. That way you compare apples to apples.
Yeah. So, couple questions.
Okay.
Nicholas asked, and this was from way earlier, what are the benefits besides power efficiency that you get from a high sensitivity speaker? Is there a dynamic range benefits, lower distortion, etc.? Something hasn't been spoken about very much.
Yeah. I actually plan to make a video about this. So higher sensitivity speakers typically, not always, but typically will have higher dynamic range and lower distortion, but within a certain window. And I think most everybody knows that in order to get sensitivity, you almost are always giving up on low frequency capability, right? So most 15-inch pro audio drivers that are in the upper 90 decibel region, their F3 is probably going to be like 70 hertz, 60 hertz, 70 hertz is kind of typical for a 15 pro audio driver. For a 6.5-inch standard sensitivity speaker with like 86 decibels, dude, you can have an FS of like 20 hertz to 30 hertz, right? So it can play lower, but once you get to a certain point, you're running out of excursion, your distortion shoots through the roof, with the higher sensitivity speaker, you get typically higher dynamic range, but you are giving up low frequency capability.
Now, a question to go along with that, Ryan Kramer makes a point in how this was us talking about measurements earlier, how some measurements are a little misleading if you're not careful. Looking at you plus or 10 minus dB frequency response when you were just talking about the F3 with like their low frequency capabilities. So a lot of times speaker manufacturers, and I'm going to go into another question after we cover this one. Speaker manufacturers will put certain things up, but they either won't reference what the plus or minus is, or they will, and it's something insane, like plus or minus 10 dB. And you
Yeah.
know it's not plus. You know it's going to be minus. They just say it that way so that, you know, you think possibly in the marketing terms that it's something more beneficial. So
yeah, I think most people don't really quite understand what plus or minus really means.
right.
You know, because they don't have like, and this is the reason I brought up this graphic, because what I do here is I bound, I calculate mean SPL between 300 hertz to 3 kilohertz. So it's basically this window right through here. And I say, okay, it's 92.6 decibels on average. And then from 80 hertz to 16 kilohertz, because some stuff happens off axis, or not off axis, but on axis sometimes above 16K. And I don't want to penalize every speaker that has a breakup mode at 18 kilohertz. So I say 80 to 16K, and I give you a bound about what, 2.5. In this case, it's 4.5, and it's because of this stupid dude right here. If I cut it off at 10K, it'd be like, I don't know, probably what, 1.5 decibels pretty much throughout, except for this guy right there. And then I have F3, and the F3 is reference to the average sensitivity. F10 is reference to the average sensitivity. And you're right, a lot of manufacturers don't do that. They'll just give you some nebulous number, and it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, what is minus 10? Well, what does that reference to anyway? And then I see some people will reference their F3 to, let's say you use a really small enclosure and it causes the peak and the base to just shoot up. Well, then now their F3 is skewed as opposed to using the F3 versus a mid-range. So I almost would say that I don't necessarily care what a manufacturer does as long as they tell you what it is. But there are some manufacturers who definitely are not as transparent as they should be.
Well, and that brings up my next point of why do all manufacturers not supply this data?
I don't know, man. You know, you could go with the cynical side and just be like, well, because they don't want their customers to know. I've had some manufacturers say that their customers won't understand it. But we're getting there
cost as well.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, they should have their own. I tell you what, if a manufacturer says that they don't release measurements because they don't have any, I would run. I would not. You can guarantee even the ones that don't, like Klipsch never publishes data for their speakers, right? But you know that they've got measurements, and they've probably got way more measurements than I ever have taken over a speaker, you know? So I don't know why manufacturers don't necessarily release this. Now, smaller manufacturers, maybe they just don't have the means, and all they've got is maybe an Omni mic, and they're like, oh, I don't really feel comfortable releasing Omni mic measurements because I know maybe they're not quite as accurate as a full anechoic chamber set of measurements and whatever. I mean, Philharmonic Dennis, he measures and he releases data, and I've actually started doing some measurements for him, but he was doing that beforehand. Jeff, I think, releases data as well, right? And
there's not very many.
Not many? Okay. We'll have to try to change that then.
No, he's saying not very many manufacturers versus Jeff doesn't release many. Jeff sent almost all of his products over the database.
Jeff is very transparent.
Okay.
I'm just saying there's very few manufacturers that are open about this.
Yeah.
That will actually release it. And I think if you guys find a manufacturer that publicly publishes their data, that should be a vote of confidence, right? They're not hiding behind anything, especially if it's Klippel data, because Klippel is a variable that can be carried across multiple manufacturers for an easy comparison, right? Because you can take the room out of the equation, you can use it anechoically. It's a very good way to benchmark this speaker against this speaker measurement wise and objectively.
Well, there's a couple brands like Magico. They have their own Klippel NFS. They publish maybe like one set of measurements. They have a marketing video published or measuring their M9, their huge tower speaker, and they have like a 30-second video that shows the Klippel going around it, but they never release measurements for it.
Oh, wow.
You know, Don Audio has their whole Jupiter system, but they don't release measurements. And I've talked to Don Audio about it. They choose not to release measurements. And I'm thinking, I understand if you want to measure stuff and not release the measurements. Like I'm not saying I quite understand it, but I'm okay with that. But when you go the extra step to say, look at the measurement system we have, and then you don't release the measurements, it's like, well, what are you doing? Like that actually, to me, that sends the wrong message. So
maybe not to everybody, because there's a big part of the space that says measurements don't matter.
Yeah. But slowly people are coming around. I think, you know, it's taken some time, but I think that once people start to understand the data a little, because I get these kind of comments a lot. Like, I've been watching your channel for a year. I didn't understand this until this video. And I'm like, all right, thanks for sticking with me.
That's right.
And we're going to keep learning together, you know, like, but it's the process. If I could teach a class on this, I would, and it would probably take all day. I've got separate videos talking about all this stuff. And even then I probably should go back and scrub those and redo them, because a lot of the things too is that these measurements are anechoic, and people will say, well, everything changes when you put it into a room. Well, not everything. Usually it's below like 500 hertz that changes, but there are certain things about, like, the data can help you understand how to position. Do you want to point it directly at you? Do you want to point it away from you? Some speakers are designed to be pointed away from you. Some speakers are designed to be put near a wall, like Kef. They're R3 Meta, R5 Meta, and some other Meta speakers are designed to be put a little bit closer to a wall because they have an extended bass shelf. If anybody's ever designed a subwoofer enclosure, you know that there's that Chevy Chev or whatever crap that thing is that basically kind of rolls off like a sealed enclosure, and then it has a little bit of a kick up, and it's a little bit of an extended bass shelf on the end. And those are designed to be put a little bit closer to a wall. If you put them all the way out into the room like a standard speaker, then there's going to be no bass, right? So you need to put them a little bit closer to the wall, but the data shows you that. And that's my shtick. I'm done.